We are in Isaiah chapter 28, and we are going to be starting with verse 3 or verse 4. But in verses 1 through 8, you have a description of the rulers that is given for us. And he discusses says, "Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden underfoot." And so in verse 4, he says that the glorious beauty, which is on the head of a fat valley, shall be a fading flower. And as the hasty fruit before the summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, yet, or while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. Samaria, and hopefully you remember kind of the description that we had of Samaria that we went through last week, appeared to Assyria as a beautiful flower that is tempting them to desire it to desire it as soon as they saw it. The fat valley, New King James has verdant valley, would be a very fertile valley. The hasty, or the first fruit that is spoken of here, would be the fig that comes before the harvest. When men saw that, they considered it a delicacy, and they quickly would eat it. Now this is how, again, Assyria is seeing Samaria in that way. Homer Haley points out that fig trees in Palestine produce 2 crops of fruit yearly. The first, referred to here, is in May or June, and the second crop in August and September. The early figs are eagerly awaited by those who have no fresh fruit before or during the winter. So they've had no fresh fruit. Here's the figs at that early season. So it was a delicacy. They waited anxiously for this. This shows the eagerness of Shalmaneser to destroy Samaria. Samaria is that delicacy to Shalmaneser. But also it indicates his desire to destroy it totally, a complete, total destruction of Samaria. Pulpit commentary notes that Samaria's siege, once begun, was pressed without intermission and lasted less than 3 years, 2 Kings 18, verses 9 and 10. A short space compared to that of other sieges belonging to the same period. For example, that of Ashdod, besieged 29 years, according to Herodotus, and that of Tyre, besieged 13 years, according to the book Ancient Monarchies, end quote. So this comparison of here's 13 years for Tyre, 29 years for Ashdod, that they besieged those cities. And then you have Shalmaneser coming to Samaria, and it takes him less than 3 years to destroy them. That shows the eagerness that he had of destroying Samaria, taking the city. That's what's being described here, that it will be a Samaria, that head of the fat valley, shall be a fading flower. It fades quickly. Hasty fruit before the summer. There's the fig illustration there, which when he looketh upon it, seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. He destroys it, in other words. So we see both aspects being presented to us here. Then in verse 5, he goes on to say, in that day shall the Lord of hosts be for a crown of glory and for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people. In that day. What day is that?
What does the context indicate? How long can I reference it up for?
Okay, whatever the context sets forth. That's what that day is. In this case, what is that day referring to? Destruction of Samaria, the northern kingdom. So, and Shalmaneser's siege against Samaria. But during this siege, this is now a ray of hope that's being given to them. Most believe that this has reference to Judah primarily, though. That it is a warning to her lest she act like Samaria and thus receive the same fate as Samaria. Thus, unto the residue of his people, the residue being the southern kingdom, Jerusalem. And thus, you have a ray of hope. You don't have to act like Samaria, the northern kingdom. Notice that here God is a crown of glory. Go back to verse 1 though. Woe to the crown of pride. So there's an obvious change from the crown of pride to, and you also see that in verse 3, the crown of pride, to verse 5 now, the crown of glory. So that crown of glory, as opposed to the crown of pride, is a fading flower. Thus, the diadem of beauty. Diadem would be a crown of, it's kind of like a headband that would be worn to show royalty. Put a crown on somebody, it shows that they are royal. Well, here's a diadem of beauty, a crown of beauty. Again, pulpit commentary states that concerning this, that, and clearly the closing of the clouds around Samaria was coincident with the dawn of a brighter day in Judah. Hezekiah came to the throne only 3 years before the fatal siege of Samaria began. His ascension must have been nearly contemporaneous with the expedition of Shalmaneser against Hoshea, when he shut him up and bound him in prison, according to 2 Kings 17 and verse 4. Yet he was not daunted by his neighbor's peril. He began his reign with a political revolution and a rebellious or a religious reformation. He threw off the yoke of Assyria to which his father had submitted, 2 Kings 18, verse 7, and he cleared the land of idols and idol worship. It was the dawn of a day of promise, and such as the prophet seems to point in these two verses. Unhappily, he says, the dawn was soon clouded over, verses 7 through 9. So you have, here's the northern kingdom. Hoshea was the king. He rebels against Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser comes, but 3 years before Shalmaneser comes, Hezekiah comes to power in the southern kingdom. Hezekiah is one of the good kings, one of the few good kings of the southern kingdom. Of course, how many did the northern kingdom have? 0. None. Out of how many? About 19. So 19 kings of the northern kingdom, 0 were good. They were all evil. And thus, the destruction by the Assyrian army. But here's Hoshea, Hezekiah. Very little, it's interesting to me, very little is said in Isaiah about Hezekiah's reform. There's references maybe like this to it, but in reality, Isaiah kind of ignores Hezekiah's reformation. Now, Hezekiah was a good king. He destroyed the idol worship, just cleared the land of idols. He restored the worship of God. And yet here's a prophet of God who basically ignores it. Anyone want to venture a guess as to what might be the reason? I think that's part of it. He knew what was going to happen shortly after that. But Hezekiah was a good king. He did all this as far as the Reformation is concerned, but what about the heart of the people? Basically, what you have in Hezekiah's reform is Hezekiah doing the Reformation, but the people really are not changed. They're the same as they were before the Reformation.
So they're going through the motions, but they still love Ashtoreth, they don't love the rest of the people.
Well, it's not so much they're going through the motion, Hezekiah is going through it. Hezekiah is doing these things.
They go through the motions as far as pretentiousness. They're like seemingly, correcting their lives, but outwardly,
No.
but in reality they're really not. They're putting on an act. They're fake.
I know what you meant, Dale. But what I'm saying is the people never changed. They continued in their wickedness, their sins. Hezekiah, Dale, listen. Hezekiah is the one who made the changes, not the people. The people remain the same. Isaiah saw that. People hadn't changed any. They hadn't turned to God. Yeah, he did a lot of it in secret. So the people didn't change. Isaiah sees this. He sees Hezekiah a good king, yes, but he never changes the people. That's what was needed. And that's kind of what Isaiah is saying here. You don't have to follow Samaria. You don't have to follow their wickedness and their destruction. You can do what's right, but it's a fading flower, even there, because the people still were evil and continued in their evil. Several of the prophets basically condemn Jerusalem and the southern kingdom for that very thing. You have followed your sister and her evil, which is the northern kingdom. And thus, they met the same fate, except it was a couple hundred years later, from 722 to 586 being the total destruction, but the initial captivity began at 606. So you had that period because of those kings that were good, that tried to bring about a reformation, but the heart of the people were never changed as far as the southern kingdom. Isaiah is saying, don't follow your wicked sister, basically using that language again. Don't follow Samaria. Learn from their mistakes. Think we can learn from the mistakes of others? We should be able to. When we don't, we're in trouble. What is it, the old adage about those who do not learn from history, what happens? They're doomed to repeat it. Yeah. Well, what's history except what others have done? You follow their way, this is what's going to happen. We're doomed to repeat what takes place if we don't learn from them. Problem is, we don't learn from others. We haven't in our nation today for several years now. We've not been taught history, and so what happens? We do the same thing as those who are in our history, and we're going to suffer the same fate. Romans 15 and verse 4, the things written aforetime, written for our learning. Now that has specific reference to, of course, to the Old Testament scriptures, but it's based upon a general principle, isn't it? I guess that's the lot of man, though, isn't it? I won't ask how many have read The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. He goes through and lists several causes of the fall of Rome and the Roman Empire. If you take the causes that he lists and you start going through them, every single one of them are in our society. Every single one. Maybe some to a more extent, some to a lesser extent, but every one of them are. Now then, why didn't we learn from that? What happened to them? You have the decline of the Roman Empire and finally the destruction of it. If we do the same thing that they did, then what's going to happen to us? Destruction. Same thing. Because we failed to learn from history. Now then, we could say that probably concerning most nations. Consider the period of the judges. What do you have there? A repeating cycle that happens over and over and over and over. What happens? The people are prosperous because of that prosperous aspect. They leave God. They forsake Him. God brings an oppressing nation over them so that they are oppressed, and they start, because of that oppression, calling to God. Save us from this. Deliver us from this oppression. God sends them a judge, a deliverer, who delivers them from that oppression. Now then, being delivered, they have a time of peace, and they become prosperous again, and guess what happens? You have a cycle that continues over and over. In fact, it's referred to many times as the cycle, because it is the same thing happening time and time again. Why didn't they learn from history? We throw up our hands and say, why didn't they learn? I mean, they do the same thing, and the same thing happens to them. Why didn't they learn better?
They love the pleasures of sin for a season.
Well, that might be part of it, yes, that they wanted to enjoy the pleasures of sin. It's only for a season, but still there's the pleasure of sin. So that might have been part of it, but they just simply did not learn from their history. Mm-hmm.
I think the technology is greater, and science has improved all this, advanced, and so they're not going to have these difficulties or these problems.
Or we can do it better. In the what's the word that I want to use? The disagreement between capitalism and fascism or socialism. Those who are on the capitalistic side many times will ask those who are the socialists, show me one time in which socialism has worked. Throughout history of man, show me one time. Can't be done. And so what do? Well, we know better, and we won't make those mistakes. And so let's do it anyway. Now then, that's basically the arguments that you see a lot of times in listening to those people who are on each side. Can't name one that has been successful because there hasn't been any. But we're going to do it anyway, and we know how to do it better. Because we're smarter and we won't make those mistakes. Well, the problem is it's inherent in the system. And inherent in sin is what? What is the result of sin? Death. Destruction. God uses, in the Old Testament, a physical nation to be an example of a spiritual aspect that we see today. They go into sin. What does God do? He brings destruction. That was physical aspect. We go into sin spiritually today. We die spiritually. There's spiritual destruction. And so God was using this so that we will learn. And that goes back to your Romans 15 and verse 4, or 1 Corinthians 10 and verse, I think it's 11, maybe 12. Other passages like unto that. Dale?
That's the reason Jesus said in Matthew 13, 15, they have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, neither do they understand.
He quotes from Isaiah because Isaiah used it to the people of his day, and it could have been used to the people of Joshua's day and the judges' day and on throughout history. And it can be used to the people of our day. Carl.
Pride and arrogance. Look at Pharaoh. How many times did God chastise him before he finally killed him in the Red Sea?
Well, I will correct one thing. The Bible never says he died in the Red Sea. His army did. But there's, from archaeological standpoint, there's a discrepancy whether he actually died then or not. But you're right. 10 plagues. And because of his pride, no, I'm not going to let them go. Of course, that was their source of building and everything, and so many of the things which they did. So why should we? Well, God proved with a very strong hand. And just as a kind of an aside, talking about Pharaoh, a lot of times we get into this discussion, God hardened his heart. How did God harden his heart? God said, let my people go. He hardened his heart. But God went against, his command went against what Pharaoh wanted. And so God hardened his heart in that way. Also, what if, now we know this didn't happen, but what if Pharaoh had let the people go initially? I want you to think, God comes back and says, I'm going to be glorified in this. If Pharaoh had said, when Moses comes and says, let my people go, if Pharaoh had let the people go, God would have been glorified in that. When Pharaoh refused and God brings the plagues, God was glorified in that. So it didn't matter what decision Pharaoh makes, the glorification of God was going to be either way. However Pharaoh decided. And it was going to show God's power either way. So, now how did we get off on Pharaoh? Carl, that's your fault. But going back, we need to learn from history, and certainly here's Isaiah telling the southern kingdom, don't follow in the footsteps of the northern kingdom. But they did, sad to say. In verse 6 then, he says, and for a spirit of judgment to him that sitteth in judgment, and for strength to them that turn the battle to the gate. God is going to inspire those who sit on the judgment seat to render justice. Someone turn back to Isaiah chapter 1, and we want to read, someone read for us verses 21 through 27. Isaiah 1, 21 through 27. And notice what it says in respect to the rendering of justice in particular case.
How the faithful city has become a harlot. It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Your sugar has become frost, your wine mixed with water, your fences are rebellious and pains of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They do not defend the fatherless, nor does the cause of the widow come before them. Therefore the Lord says, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will rid myself of my adversaries and take vengeance on my enemies. I will turn my hand against you and thoroughly purge away your dross and take away all your alloy. I will restore your judges as at the first and your counselors at the beginning. After you shall be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Is that it?
Through 27.
Zion shall be redeemed with justice, and her penitence with righteousness.
Notice all the references to justice in that. and all of the contrast with what they are. They accepted bribes. The cause of the widow would not come before them. And on it goes as far as injustice.
Sorry for reading it so slow. I had underlined multicolored and blurred my eye out of vision. I'm sorry.
Okay. But here, a spirit of justice or judgment to him that sitteth in just judgment. So God is going to inspire that justice as opposed to the injustice that we read there in chapter 1. He's also going to give strength to them that defend the city. And he's going to turn back the enemy from the gate of the city. Someone read 2 Kings and chapter 18, verses 7 and verse 8. 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 7 and 8. Okay. What is it? He was successful. He rebelled against the king of Assyria. You would think, since Assyria was the main power at that time, that they would destroy him, but they didn't. And this is speaking about Hezekiah. Hezekiah didn't serve him anymore, as the kings before him had. And now then, he smites the Philistines, enlarges the borders of the nation. So he became successful as far as the enemy is concerned. But because of Hezekiah's faithfulness, judgment against Judah is delayed. A few years after Samaria fell, now when was its fall? 722 or 21 BC. The Assyrians, who Hezekiah refused to give tribute to and refused to serve him, they came into Judah, the southern kingdom. They destroyed 48 walled cities. In 2 Chronicles and chapter 31 and verse 1, it says, after these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered into Judah and encamped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. So that's the idea that Sennacherib had, to win all these cities, and he does take several. 48 walled cities. Look at Isaiah chapter 36 and verse 1. It came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defense cities of Judah and took them. So here's Sennacherib coming to destroy Jerusalem. He takes all of these cities, walled cities, but yet God is saying he's going to give strength to them that turn the battle to the gate. So they come through, they destroy 48 walled cities. Then in 701, So this is about 20 years after the destruction of Samaria. They encamped against Jerusalem. But what happened to them?
5,000 soldiers woke up dead.
Okay. That's what happened. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and verse 21. It says, "And the Lord sent an angel which cut off all the mighty men of valor, and the leaders and the captains in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned with shame of face to his own land. And when he was come into the house of his God, they that came forth of his own bowels slew him there with the sword." Now, and elsewhere we learn that, yes, it is 185,000 soldiers. Not all of them, but you lose 185,000 soldiers, you've lost a big chunk of your army. And so Sennacherib hurries home while he's worshiping his idol. Then his sons kill him, two of his sons, and another son takes over his place. Kind of shows a little bit as to the lack of respect that they had concerning life and concerning even family members, that they would go in and kill their own father. Well, you see that continually with a lot of these nations. But if you remember, I think it was last week, we read about the atrocities of the Assyrians. They were a vicious, ferocious people, especially in war. And so Sennacherib would have been used to that, but so would his sons. But God protected the city of Jerusalem. Why? Because of the righteousness of Hezekiah, because he was a good king. And that goes back to something we've mentioned before, but bears repeating, that those who are righteous can spare the unrighteous. Were the people of Jerusalem righteous? Not too much. But Hezekiah was. No doubt there were others, but there's a small remnant that was going to be saved. But because of Hezekiah's righteousness, his goodness, God spared Jerusalem. God would have spared Sodom and Gomorrah for how many righteous souls? 10. As Paul was traveling to Rome, and that Euroclydon that came up, how many souls were on board that ship? Anybody remember? 276. Very good. And God tells Paul, because of you, everyone will be spared. The righteousness of one individual spared the 276 people on board. How many people is God saying I'm sparing the United States of America for today? Of course, we don't know. We never can know. But we also know that the patience of God runs out, doesn't it? God is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But what's going to happen? his patience comes to an end. God's patience came to an end with the northern kingdom of Samaria at 722, when Sennacherib destroyed them. But Judah, the southern kingdom, because of the few good kings that they had, God spared them a little bit longer, but his patience came to an end, didn't it? And so Nebuchadnezzar finally destroys the city in 586 BC. God's patience, God is patient, but his patience will come to an end.
How long has the Vietnam War lasted? About 7 or 8 or 9 years, isn't it? You do the stats, and in Chicago, in that period of time, about as many people died in Chicago over that period of time as died in the Vietnam War. You know?
I'm not sure how that connects, but and it was a lot, I think a lot longer than 7 or 8 years of Vietnam War, but God's patience runs out. Now then, God's patience is going to run out in a way in which the world will come to an end at some point in time. The statement there in 2 Peter 3 and verse 9, that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance, and talks about his long suffering, is stated in the midst of this world's going to be destroyed. Everything in this world. What is it? God's patience will run out, and he will destroy the world. And there will be the final judgment, and we will go into eternity, either of heaven or torment. So we'll end with that, and Lord willing, begin with verse 7 then next week.